some room.
Well, it started. The West Coast labor negotiations have begun. People are paying attention to it this year, but do you really know what their relationship has been like through the years and who the players are? Let's break it down. Hi, welcome to By Land and By Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain, presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Beagen, founder of the Maritime Professor and Squall Strategies, and I'm your favorite maritime attorney. Join me every week as we walk through both ocean transport and surface transport topics in the wild world of supply chain. As always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice, and there is no attorney-client privilege created by this video. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. So before we get into the discussion of the day, let's go through my top 3 stories of the week. Number 1. So there's a lot of movement and a lot of hype and a lot of interest around offshore wind. And I like to keep a watchful eye on what's going on there. So one of the issues that keeps coming up is kind of the environmental impact of the equipment of the offshore wind turbines, and questions of what happens at the end of life, what happens to the marine life surrounding the bases, and really, can there be a net positive effect here? So Ørsted, one of the major players in the offshore wind world, is trying to do just that. So we've often heard of old containers being sunk to try and generate artificial reefs, locations for coral reefs. Now Ørsted is hoping that coral reefs will be able to generate and grow on the base of offshore wind turbines. Pretty interesting. So roughly speaking, they're going to be using kind of the infant stage coral reef that washes ashore. They're not going to go pull these infant stages out of an already kind of blossoming environmental ecosystem, but I think I have that right. I think they're going to be waiting for these infant stages to wash ashore, and then they're going to be somehow connecting that to the turbine bases. I'm not exactly sure on all the science behind this, but I think this is cool. I mean, why not? I'm going to keep a watchful eye here to see what happens, but this seems interesting. I think that this could have some pretty interesting implications. And certainly, if we can have a net positive, more things happening with this offshore wind that are maybe enhancing and doing good, I think that's a good thing. So story number 2 today, the U.S. Department of Transportation's Maritime Administration, so MARAD, has a new maritime administrator. We've talked about this before. Rear Admiral Ann Phillips of the U.S. Navy, retired, she was previously nominated. She has been confirmed by the U.S. Senate. So it's a nomination of by the president's office, by the administration, and confirmed by the Senate. Confirmation happened. She is now the 20th administrator of MARAD, DOT Maritime Administration, and she'll also actually be the first woman to be confirmed to this role, or she is the first woman to be confirmed to this role. Previously, we had Lucinda Leslie, who was working as the acting administrator. So I think technically she was the first administrator, but she was acting in that role. But Rear Admiral Phillips will now be the first confirmed maritime administrator of the U.S. Department of Transportation Maritime Administration. So this is exciting. This is cool. She has some very heavy environmental experience and obviously her Navy experience. I think she's going to have some good things, and I just love to see the, having MARAD have an actual person in there. I think that there's a lot of benefit that comes from that permanency of somebody actually being in that role. So stay tuned. This is going to be exciting. Likewise, the very first Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard was also confirmed. There's been some really great stuff for women happening recently. So story number 3, a quick announcement of an interesting webinar taking place next week. So on May 17th, the CMTS, so that's the U.S. Committee on Marine Transportation Systems, it's an executive level federal interagency coordinating committee. I actually want to pause here. I recommend that you take a look at the CMTS website. So just Google CMTS Maritime or Committee on Marine Transportation Systems. They have a really great compendium. We've talked about this before, but they have a really, really informative compendium that kind of breaks down all the different areas all the different topics that might be in the maritime transportation system, marine transportation system, and which agency. They pair that with which agency, and oftentimes it's overlapping, but which agency deals directly with that issue. It is so interesting and so helpful. I recommend you go check that out. But anyway, so the CMTS, really great executive level federal interagency coordinating committee, is going to be co-hosting a virtual panel discussion with the American Association of Port Authorities, the AAPA. They're going to be talking about current infrastructure investments and meeting future marine transportation systems requirements. So the panelists include Lucinda Leslie. So she's actually chair of the CMTS coordinating board and the former acting administrator of MARAD. So and Rear Admiral Ann Phillips will be moving into that role, but also the CEO of AAPA. So Chris Connor is going to be there. And they're going to have some really great expert panelists lined up in really very relevant areas that you'd actually probably want to hear from if you wanted to learn more about port maritime infrastructure. So they have engineers, they have port officials, they have Department of Transportation high-ranking officials, economists. I mean, it's really well thought out panel. It's going to be a great discussion. I'm going to put the info in the show notes after this, but go check it out. It's going to be next week, May 17th. So look, let's get into the meat and potatoes of the day here. The ILWU and PMA negotiations have kicked off. They kicked off this week. So let's break it down. All right. So wait. Who is negotiating here? Let's start with the basics. Let's get all on the same page. That's what I'm all about. I want to make sure everybody's starting from the same page here. So there's two parties involved. We have the ILWU. So that's the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. So that's the labor, ILWU. And we have the PMA, the Pacific Maritime Association, and that's essentially the employers. So the ILWU, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. So it began in 1902, roughly began. So the longshoremen were loosely affiliated at that time with the American Federation of Labor's International Longshoremen's Association, the ILA. You might be questioning that a little bit. The ILA now is mostly known as the East Coast Labor Union for the most part of port workers. But in 1902, it was a loose affiliation that kind of went through different iterations of association until in 1934, there was a 3-month-long strike on the West Coast. It was called the West Coast Waterfront Strike. And from that, in 1937, the union was officially established for the West Coast. So that's when the International Longshore and Warehouse Union really officially kicked off. So 1937. So nowadays, ILWU represents 15,500 port workers, and it spans from California, Oregon, Washington State, but it also represents Hawaii and British Columbia, Canada. And more than 40% of U.S. incoming container traffic is moving through LA and Long Beach. So the ILWU's impact and their connection to, 40%, if not more, of all of the incoming container traffic, it's a huge reach. So the ILWU is a big deal in terms of labor on the West Coast and just nationally. So the PMA, so the Pacific Maritime Association, who are they? So they were founded in 1949, and they're actually a nonprofit corporation. So it's 72 members, and they are composed of cargo carriers, terminal operators, and stevedores that operate along the U.S. West Coast. So the PMA represents shipping lines and terminal operators at, roughly 20 West Coast ports. Their president and CEO, Jim McKenna, has been out in the news recently. You'll probably see him quite a bit as we continue on these labor discussions. And their stated mission, the PMA's stated mission is, and I quote, to provide industry leadership to our member companies through innovative labor relations, human resources, and administrative services. As you can imagine, their board of directors are obviously representative of the top ocean carriers of the world. These include Hapag-Lloyd, Maersk, MSC, Costco. So for those of you not in kind of the ocean world, Costco should not be confused with Costco, the bargain warehouse in the US. Costco, the ocean shipping line, doesn't have a T in it. Different companies. So Costco, the non-T, COSCO, Ocean Line. Ocean Network Express, and CMA, CGM. I mean, these are just to name a few of the board of directors that are representative of the ocean carriers of the PMA. So what has the relationship been like through the years between the ILWU and the PMA? There's been years of smooth sailing, and there's been some years of contention. So in 2002, let's take it back 20 years. There was actually a 10-day lockout by the PMA of the ILWU, so of the employers, of the labor workers, the ILWU dock workers. And then President Bush had to get involved. Former President Bush had to get involved. So the negotiations concluded in December of that year with a new contract. The issues here were surrounding the terminal, marine clerks, and their use of computers and computerization and IT equipment for transmitting data. Remember, this was 2002. So this didn't affect the longshore equipment operators, but it certainly did impact the marine clerks. Automation. So automation was an issue again in 2008. The two parties sat down early, mid-March. So right now, here we are. It's I believe they sat down midweek this week. So let's say May 11th. In 2008, the two parties sat down early in mid-March. Remember that these agreements usually expire end of June, July 1st is when this one expires. So mid-March is pretty early. The agreement wasn't reached until August that year. So in 2008, no lockouts were reported, but slowdowns until the new agreement was inked. That was, we saw slowdowns. There was a walk-off of workers at the port of Tacoma for several hours at one point. I mean, these are kind of mild contentions, but, part of the negotiation. And in 2015, we actually had to use these negotiations actually had to use the U.S. Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service had to step in to facilitate the discussions. I'm so used to rattling off the U.S. Federal Maritime Commission. That's not this. This is the U.S. Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. Actually, an agency that I was unfamiliar with until I looked a little bit further into it, but interesting. So on February 20th of that year, the U.S. Labor Secretary Thomas Perez announced that the ILWU and PMA long-term contract discussions had actually come to an agreement and thereby a conclusion. That was February 20th. So these discussions were in 2015. That was 10 months after negotiations. And at the time, I mean, it seemed crazy, but there was mounting congestion starting at the U.S. West Coast ports. We've talked about that congestion being identified in 2015. The FMC had their eye on it, and it was certainly brought to light, though, not as mainstream as it is today, but it was brought to light in 2015 that there was mounting congestion, and these negotiations were, there was all sorts of troubles that was happening from it, that it, in order for the solution to come, the labor secretary was involved, and the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service had to get involved. So that was 2015. So in 20, and I will say, it seemed that the discussions from 2015 seemed to be a little bit of a sore memory, if you will, for these negotiations. So in 2019, there was actually a vote to extend the contract for 3 more years. So, in 2019, there was kind of a good faith move here. So this extended the contract that was set to expire in 2019. So 2019 through July 1st, 2022. So obviously nobody saw the pandemic coming at that time. But at the time, like I said, it was kind of a good faith move to extend the contract. There were some benefits that each side received through that extension. But, this was kind of a good faith move. So in 2015, it really had been the worst case scenario model. So, it showed the history of extreme delay and contention. The Obama administration had to get involved in 2015, and it took 10 months of negotiations at that point. So fast forward to current day. All reports these days suggest that the relationship is healthy. 2019 kind of suggested that with the delay there for 3 years. So we have to believe that means the negotiations are starting from a good place. But just last week, there was a little hiccup to that healthy relationship. So, automation is always a contentious issue for this negotiation. In general, East Coast Labor Group, the ILA, the International Longshoremen Association that we talked about previously, has had a little bit more hard-lined in the rejection of the automation, and the ILWU has been a little bit, mildly more accepting of automation and kind of just general digitization and movement toward, less manpower, more, as the name suggests, automation. It's not necessarily robots taking over, but it's kind of an all-encompassing when we say automation. So current day, about 2 weeks ago, the beginning of the month of May, the PMA released a report that they had commissioned that analyzed public and previously unpublished data, in part about the import surge on the West Coast and the automation benefits found. So this was, 2 weeks before they were due to sit down with the ILWU workforce and talk. So the report basically said that, and I quote, the registered ILWU workforce in Los Angeles and Long Beach increased over 11% compared to 8% for the other 27 West Coast ports. And they were leaning heavily on the data that the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which process 40% of containerized imports from Asia, bore the brunt of the influx. So essentially the report was saying that the ILWU workforce in LA Long Beach increased during that time over 11%. That's kind of good, right? The ILWU wasn't happy about this report being released and released a statement. Like I said, the report generally was about automation and the benefits that were seen from the automation and again, automation, digitization, automation is a more encompassing tone and a more encompassing word than just robots replacing people. But the ILWU was not happy, and they released a statement via Twitter saying, and I'm going to be quoting this here, it's been brought to our attention that the PMA has released a report that the union has not yet had an opportunity to review. Continuing, however, based on the press release issued, it's apparent that the report is a self-serving document by one party to a labor contract. And even worse, is an insult to all workers who have seen their jobs outsourced to machines. The very purpose of automation is to replace human workers with machines, and in this case, to harm a US-based workforce and local communities only to increase the profits of the largely foreign-owned terminal operators. So what they're talking about there, so the terminal operators, these terminals are often, or maybe not often, but they are owned by the ocean carriers and foreign companies. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. The tweets continued. The bottom line is that automation has destroyed longshore jobs. Container volume has increased at the automated terminals, but this has been at the expense of other terminals that have had an offsetting drop in container volumes. The increased productivity that the PMA is claiming at the two automated terminals has meant less work at other terminals and an overall loss of employment for longshore workers. We haven't seen an overall increase in productivity at the ports, just a shell game to mask the human cost of job destruction. Remember how I said that it was reported that this was a healthy relationship? Look, I'm not saying that it's not a healthy relationship, and this isn't saying that it's not a healthy relationship. But yeah, the tweet said that they didn't even have an opportunity to review the report. Look, that stood out to me. If the PMA really wanted this to be accepted, that's a key error. If you want a spirit of honest negotiations, then conduct yourself in an honest way yourself, up to and during the negotiations, and really all the time. Just be decent and respectful, and you'd be amazed at how far that goes. And look, this is just generally speaking. So I think that the PMA probably should have maybe sent a report over to the ILWU prior to releasing it publicly. Even if that means a day or two prior, I guess probably best case would have been releasing it and having them review it and having them, allowing them to have time to put out their information and their thoughts on the report simultaneously, shortly thereafter. I don't know, 2 weeks before you're due to sit down, it just shakes it up a little bit in the wrong direction. Look, this is all generally speaking, and I'm an outsider for the most part. I am not part of these negotiations. This is my outside view looking in on this relationship. So the contract was delayed until 2019. It was delayed until 2022. So it was delayed until 2022. There was some talk this past fall, a request to delay again, but look, at this point, it was denied. We were already, 2021, we were well into the pandemic. Nobody in 2019 saw the pandemic coming, but it is what it is. It had already been delayed. So there was a denial of extending this contract any further. So here we are. We're in it. We're starting the negotiations. So let's get back to the automation piece a little bit. Look, I've spoken about automation before. Automation is the only way, really. I mean, this is me speaking. Automation, I see, is the only way that we, as the United States, can even attempt to remain a major player on the global supply chain scene. We, as a country, are pretty good at investing in infrastructure. I mean, for the most part, we don't really do so great of a job of maintaining that infrastructure all the time. And really, furthermore, the ports have been woefully underfunded. I'm going to say that again. The ports have been woefully underfunded compared to the amount of money that goes elsewhere for years. Recently, we've gotten a little bit better there, but ports generally, they need a lot more money than they're getting. Look, the ports are the entry point of all goods coming into this country. I say this a lot. 90% of everything that we touch, eat, consume, use moves by ocean transit. And if it can't get off the vessels into the trucks and the warehouses, then we as a country are in big trouble. So wouldn't you want that most important piece of landing and bringing onto our shores all of this stuff? I mean, all of this stuff, 90% of all of things needs to come by ocean ship or does come by ocean shipping. We're in big trouble if we don't put a lot more money into our ports. Look, it's been reported that about 40 ports globally either currently or plan to operate automated terminals. And certainly the Rotterdam, Singapore, and many Chinese terminals are showcasing some of the best in automation technology. Look, this might be naive, but I see automation not as replacing a human job. I mean, sure, if it's boiled down, yes, it is a replacement, but I don't see it as that. I see it as more as the job is transforming into something that's probably a little bit more tenable for the workforce. So now, instead of typing in 13 character container numbers or however many character container numbers, you can QA the container numbers that have been pre-entered elsewhere. And that's probably a basic read of it, but you know what I mean? There will still be a need for human interaction and quality assurance. A very important role, I might add, this quality assurance. And again, this is an over distillation, an overgeneralization, an oversimplification of what's happening here. And I certainly, I think that our workforce is the most important. I mean, it's crucial to having all of those goods offloaded off of that vessel and put onto our shores. Human element will always need to be there. So let's talk about the forecast. What do I see? Where do I see this moving? What's going to happen next? Look, this is going to take some time. Are they going to complete the negotiations by July 1st? I mean, it's May, June, July. I really don't see it. I'm going to say probably not. If history suggests anything, this is going to take a little bit longer. Is there going to be a strike? I certainly hope not. I don't think there's going to be. I think we're going to see an impact on the throughput of cargo. Certainly, if there's a stalemate on the contract after the July 1st deadline, perhaps we'll see a short-term contract, much like the continuing resolutions that we so often see in Congress these days, kind of a shorter term or kind of an initial agreement that happens so they can kind of stay in the light of what each side is doing. Maybe we'll see work continue as normal and the back pay retroactive application of all of the new contract will be built into the new contract. That would certainly add another layer of complexity. So basically what I'm saying is maybe they'll say we agree to agree later and we'll back cover any of this period of time from July 1st on with that new contract. Maybe that'll be a thing. I think that would be a great way to handle it in kind of a structurally sound way in terms of kind of contract negotiations. I think this is going to be interesting. I think that, I don't know if the mainstream media is going to be picking this up much. I didn't see much mainstream media outside of the industry sources this week. Certainly the industry sources were talking about that this week, but I don't think this is going to be a 60 Minutes issue until, maybe June. It kind of probably depends on how it's looking. Are they going to come up with a contract? Maybe if there's no contentiousness as we start to close in on that June 30th, July 1st deadline, Maybe not. Maybe this won't hit mainstream media. I certainly think that if there's any slowdowns at the ports, there's a lot of things that are building up. I think that the zero COVID policy in Asia, in China, is adding an X factor. I don't know if we're going to see another outpouring or overfilling of imports coming to our shores. There's a lot of people suggesting that we might see that. If we see that, and if we don't have a contract or if we don't have a contract in place, are we going to see a slowdown? Are we going to see hiccups to that labor relationship that's happening on the West Coast? I don't know. This is where it all starts to get really, really troublesome. And I think that's why there's so much attention being paid to what happens here. And then it is July that this contract would be June 30th, July 1st, that would the contract switchover would be set to happen. What happens when we start to, we saw some trouble. Is Santa going to arrive this year? I think this year we're going to see a lot more front loading of Christmas cargo, just to offset any delays that you might see from any, if there's congestion or whatever happening again this fall. I think there's going to be some front loading of that. Is that going to be overlapping with some of these contract negotiations and some of the uncertainty surrounding there? I've heard reports already that the East Coast is seeing an uptick in some of the ports of entry, just so that you can try to avoid some of the uncertainty around the West Coast. But look, it's still, the fact of the matter is 40% of everything comes through LA and Long Beach. So we're not going to be able to redirect all of that cargo. I've said this before. I think diversification of the ports of entry is going to be a key factor in people trying to control how their cargo makes it into the U.S. again. So I think that will be longer standing than the short term of the diversification of the ports of entry. But I think that will always be going forward, built into some of these. So that's it. Those are the highlights. Look, I'm watching. I think the world is watching here. Everyone is hopeful for a positive and quick resolution. History may not suggest that it's actually going to happen in a quick and positive fashion, but let's see. This is a fresh start. 2015 and those years were, like I said, they were a sore spot for this relationship. 2019 saw a fresh start, a new page. And I think everybody, now that we're coming out of the pandemic, now they're coming out of some of this severe congestion cargo troubles, everybody wants to try to work together, or maybe that's the naive, hopeful side of me. But I hope that they want to try to work together. That obviously the reports coming out is that everybody's willing and happy and excited to be getting into this negotiation. We'll see. I'm going to obviously keep following it. So as always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice directly related to your matter. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. If you have specific legal questions, feel free to reach out to me through my legal company, Squall Strategies. But again, this is just educational purposes only. But if you have non-legal questions, e-learning, general industry information, and insights, come find me at the Maritime Professor. I'd be happy to chat with you. If you like these videos, let me know. These videos live on my YouTube page, By Land and by Sea, presented by the Maritime Professor. And while you're at it, check out our website, themaritimeprofessor.com. So until next week, this is Lauren Beagen, the Maritime Professor, and you've just listened to By Land and by Sea. See you next time.